Welcome, everyone. I'm Kate Wheeler. I am President and CEO of Crystal Cove Conservancy, and I'm here with Teju Adisa-Farrar. Thanks so much for joining us tonight for the first in our six-part 2021 speaker series. It's wonderful to see so many of you on the call. We had a little screen share thing going on at the beginning, so not sure what that was, but hopefully that will be the only time we have that problem. Teju is going to share her screen in a couple of minutes. Of course, it would be better if we could all be together at the Cove and could catch up, but until then, we're really grateful to have all of you with us. I'm thrilled to have Teju with us today to take really a deep dive into the intersection between environmental and social justice. Teju, thanks so much for joining us today.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
All right. Before we get started, I just wanted to give a couple of notes for those on the call. As we go along, you'll want to put your questions in the chat, and we'll get to as many of them as we can toward the end. And you also might want to put your view in speaker view. To do that, on the top right of your Zoom window, you'll see view. Just click on that and select speaker view rather than gallery view, and you'll probably have a better experience of the talk. So I'd like to start with a little bit of context, who we are for those of us who are new to for those of you who are new to the Conservancy, and why this topic. Many of you know Crystal Cove because you know the cottages or the Beachcomber Cafe. What you may not know is how the cottages and the food services in the park support so much of our broader work. Because we hold the concession contract in the park, we're both the nonprofit partner and the concessionaire. So revenue from both cottage rentals and food service stays right here at the Cove, supporting our work to protect, preserve, and educate. Like so many relationships in the park, that relationship between the cottages and concessions, as well as our work in education and conservation, that's a symbiotic relationship. The cottages and food service in the park provide revenue and facilities to support our STEM education programs while also supporting the ongoing maintenance of the historic structures in the park. In turn, our education programs, while developing young scientists' minds and cultivating their connection to our planet, those provide rigorous and engaging science education that's grounded in ongoing conservation work, habitat restoration, and environmental research. Data that our students collect, in turn, informs land managers' responses to critical conservation questions and helps us protect the fragile habitat for our residents, the gnatcatchers and snowy plover and owl limpets that call the park home. For some, the link between social justice and environmental justice is still hazy, and that's okay. But equity and inclusion have always been at the heart of our mission at the Conservancy, to provide access and opportunities for people from different backgrounds and experiences to share in our work to protect Crystal Cove and places like it. So whether that's through the low costs of the cottages, protecting access to the beach and the coast for our community, or providing our education programs to underserved students, inclusion and equity have always been inextricably linked with our mission. Our programs are focused on providing access and deep engagement for students who come from under-resourced schools in underserved communities, largely communities of color. Of the 10,000 or so students that we serve each year, 45% speak a language other than English at home. Half identify as Latinx, and most come from inland communities like Santa Ana and Anaheim. These are students and schools that have the least opportunity to engage deeply with outdoor education and science learning. For many of our younger students, even though they live just a few miles from the coast, this is their first time to the beach when they come on a field trip with one of our programs. And while field trips are a highlight of our programs, there's so much more than that. Each field trip is bookended by as many as 10 to 15 in-class lesson plans that allow our students to act as working scientists on ongoing conservation projects in the field. And since COVID hit, all of these programs have been adapted for distance learning. So this work on equity and inclusion is important to us. It's at the heart of what we do, and we believe in being both transparent and intentional about it as we go along. I also know that it's difficult work at a difficult time, and I'm really heartened by the response that we've gotten from all of you as we take it up. So that's why we're really excited to have Teju with us tonight to talk about her experience as a Jamaican-American writer, geographer, facilitator, speaker, researcher, and poet. She hails from Oakland, but when there's not a pandemic, she goes where the work calls her. For more than a decade, she spent her time on political and racial and environmental justice. Her focus is on environmental and cultural equity, climate justice, alternative geographies, urbanism, and sustainable futures. Teju, I want to start by reading one of the poems from your book, To Belong, which you can all download for free. We're going to put a link to it in the chat. So I'd like to read this poem that you wrote. It's called I Only Know. What follows is a series of lies Black people are told and reproduce for ourselves. They are lies not because they are untrue. They are lies because they are limits. They are lies because they are opposite to our creation. They are lies because they keep us fearful of what we're born from. 1, Black people do not go camping. 2, Black people cannot swim. 3, Black people don't do nature. 4, Black people don't like bugs. 5, Black people are scared of the forest. What follows is a series of historical truths propagated by the present and the premise that we constantly define what Black is, and we continue to defy what Black is not, and everything else is for the birds. 1, my father told me one of his friends would make fried chicken over an open fire when they camped. Many Africans jumped overboard with their children and chose to drown rather than live as someone's slave. We are nature because we are survival and each other. 4, all children harass ants, Black children included. 5, lynching was not too long ago. These are not facts, they are only things I know. So that was from your book, To Belong. Will you tell us a little bit about that piece? When did you write it? And was there something in particular that inspired it?
First of all, thank you for reading it. That was such a lovely reading. No one has read that poem aloud, so thank you for choosing that, Kate. To Belong is a chapbook that I wrote in 2017 when I was in Israel and Palestine visiting ecological villages. I was actually there to think about how ecological villages operate in a context with so much conflict, but I ended up being inspired to do this chapbook on the side. And I wrote that poem because when I first arrived, I was staying at a village called Shiramama outside of Tel Aviv, and it was Israelis and mostly white European women who were volunteering there. And they were running around with their shoes off. They were like rolling around in the dirt. They looked so comfortable and free. And I felt so uncomfortable, even though I had grown up camping, I had grown up working in the garden, I had grown up being around nature. And then I traveled to Area C, which is the area where Israelis and Palestinians can cross together to stay at a peace center eco-village, which allowed Israelis and Palestinians to come together to reconcile. And one of the Palestinians said to me, you should go to Jericho. It's like Africa. There are Black people there like you. And instantly in that moment, I was reminded of my ancestry before the United States and before Jamaica, when West Africans were living in forests, living in variegated landscapes, having relationships with plants and medicine and growing and fiber cultivation, and that actually through years of enslavement and colonialism, this connection has been severed for me. And even though I've had none of those experiences, I still carry some of those myths with me. And so that allowed me to just like relax and remember that I can heal my relationship to nature. And so that poem was me negotiating that process in a very different context to the US and in a context which I'm not from, but was still grappling with some of these issues and these tensions.
Wow. Well, it's wonderful. And the whole book is wonderful. Your writing, all of it really inspires me. As we've taken up this work on equity and inclusion at the Conservancy, we've had some questions about how it fits with our mission to protect Crystal Cove State Park, use it as an outdoor classroom and a learning lab. So I'm particularly glad to be having this conversation with you, and I'm so glad to have so many people on with us to help us understand it at a deeper level. So would you start first by telling us a bit about what has inspired you to do this work in the beginning? I think that would help set the context.
So the first place I grew up in was in West Oakland, which at the time was one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in the country, which I didn't know. My parents, who were both at UC Berkeley doing their PhDs, were not really shown houses in other parts of Oakland. And West Oakland is situated between three freeways and adjacent to the Port of Oakland. And so as a result, kids in West Oakland have asthma at 8 times higher rates than other children. So my brother and I grew up having asthma, and luckily our parents had health care, so we can go to the hospital, and we had inhalers. And although at the time there was no grocery stores in West Oakland, my parents went to farmers markets and drove to other parts of town to get us organic food. We also grew food in our yard, and most people on our street did not have gardens to grow plants, let alone food. So although I grew up in this context of environmental pollution, my ability to process what was happening and have resources was different because of the position of my parents. And simultaneously, I was spending a lot of time in Spanish Town, Jamaica, where my grandmother lived, and spending time in an area that at that point wasn't very developed, has been heavily developed now. And one of the beaches that I used to love going to no longer exists because of sea level rise, and because the Jamaican government allowed a Chinese company to dig out the rest of the sand to create a highway to Ocho Rios, which is a tourism city in Jamaica. And so my experiences of the environment are not only about growing up camping and hiking and spending time in Jamaica, but also growing up with pollution and recognizing the way that climate change is impacting the island and home of my mother that I love so much. And so this has really fueled me to think about what that means and how my identity as a Black person, as a Jamaican person, as an American person relates to the environment based on all of these histories that I'm a part of and my personal experience growing up. So it's developed from there, and I've gotten really interested in regenerative agriculture and supply chains, and I've lived all over the world, so I always am thinking about transnational solidarity. But really, my upbringing was sort of the foundation that inspired me to do this work.
Oh, wonderful. Thanks. I'd really love to just turn it over to you now to share your experience and your expertise and your screen with us. To all of those of you on the call, remember you can put your questions in the chat. We'll be watching that as Teju talks, and then we'll come back to those in just a bit and answer as many of them as we can. So Teju, they are all yours. Can you share your screen?
Yes.
Great.
So as Kate said, I'm going to talk a little bit about my experiences, and in the context of land equity and access in the US. Now, this will not be at all comprehensive. Again, I'm not trained as a historian, I'm trained as a geographer. So I like to think about identity and people's relationship to physical places and space. So I'm going to just share a little bit about some moments in the history of the US that have led to some of the feelings that I shared with Kate, and some of the reasons why I do the work that I do currently. So I just want to start by sharing a little bit about myself, because it's very hard to begin this conversation about land access and equity, and it seems so big. So I like to situate myself in the conversation. I love adventure. I love outdoors. I visited the hot springs in Iceland. Um, I went on a wonderful safari in Botswana when I was partnering with the United States Embassy. I even hitchhiked through Palestine and Israel, but actually this picture is of me in Jordan because I crossed the border to go see Petra, because I love Petra and it's beautiful and gorgeous. And so that chapbook was from this time when I was hitchhiking through Palestine and Israel. And so I've had these wonderful experiences across the globe. But actually, it wasn't until a couple years ago where I had been to my third national park. And the place that I went was Moab, Arches National Park. And I fell in love with Utah. I was like, this is so beautiful. How did I not know about the beauty that existed in this country and the natural landscape? I actually missed my flight to Moab. So I drove through a snowstorm from Denver all the way to Utah at like 3 in the morning. I do not recommend it, but I saw the landscape change from this snowy mountainous place to the desert, and I was mesmerized. And so what any child does when they want to know why they didn't have this experience growing up, I called both of my parents. I was like, what is happening? How come we didn't go to national parks when I was growing up? How come there's this whole part of the United States that I haven't seen? And this is my parents when they first met. My mom had arrived from Jamaica to do her PhD in ethnic studies and literature. And my dad came from Boston. He drove cross country to study archaeology and anthropology. So they loved outdoors, they loved nature. And so growing up, we would always go on these adventures. And so I was surprised that I had missed this whole part of the US and that we never had adventures there. And so when I called my dad, he said, I was worried about the safety of our family. To send a Black family into the forest in a place like Colorado or Utah surrounded by white people with guns really worries me. And my mom said, I wanted to be able to take us to places where we wouldn't be harassed because we were Black. And so even though we were adventurous and loved to be outside, our mobility was limited because my parents' fear of the areas that national parks were and being in nature and maybe experiencing violence based on our race. And so Carolyn Finney wrote, while most African Americans have never seen a lynching, the act of terror perpetrated on a Black person in the woods is remembered both for the place where it happened and the act itself. And so she said this in her book, Black Faces, White Spaces. And so there's this idea that even though most of us who have lived or grew up in the time that I grew up in have not experienced lynching, have not seen people in the woods hanging from trees, that idea that that could happen to us is still very much ingrained in our psyche. And so I often have to get over my fear of going to natural places and realize that it's a myth and that actually I'm scared of these things because of historical legacies, but I can overcome them. So these historical legacies lead to current fear and exclusion from natural spaces and national parks. And so I want to talk a little bit about these histories and why they've come to consume my thought space so much, and why I think it's really important for us to do the work of increasing our awareness and increasing the ways we think about including people into national parks, into state parks, into the natural landscape that we all know and love. I want to start way far back, and I know this may seem a little odd, but I promise it makes sense with this phrase called res nullius, which is a Latin derived phrase from private Roman law. And it's one of the laws that they use to take over a lot of land and expand their empire. And so the definition is whereby res is not yet the object of rights or any specific subject. So in this case, it means res would be ownerless property. If someone is not producing on their land or using it in a way that the Roman government felt was productive, then it technically was ownerless property and they could claim it. This same ideology was taken to the shores of North America by colonial settlers who were coming to take advantage of the landscape to create new lives for themselves. And there was this belief that all of this land was ownerless property, that it wasn't being used productively, and so therefore it belonged to no one. And so this informed the way that they interacted with the indigenous people who had been here stewarding the land for centuries. This idea that since they were not producing from it in the way that European traders and merchants thought should be produced, it therefore was not seen as land that they owned. And indigenous communities didn't even think of land as something that you could own. It was something that you were a part of. You couldn't take control of it. So this ideology that was sort of imported from Europe, based in Roman law and Roman imperialism, this ideology linked land value and ownership to profit production, rather than the indigenous principles of land value being linked to stewardship, interdependence, and regeneration. So there is these two ideas about land that were being created in this frontier space of North America, and it shaped the way European settlers related to the land and then related to indigenous people and later on enslaved Africans. But also with these ideologies, there were diseases and foreign plants that were brought to the landscape that changed the landscape. There's so many examples of this, but I want to talk about Ohlone acorns and coast live oak because I'm in California, because I'm in Northern California. So before Spanish settlers came to what is now Northern California, the Ohlone were harvesting acorns. That was something that they did. They made acorn flour, acorn mush. They used acorns in a way that was aligned with the endemic nature of them falling from the trees and then harvesting them and collecting them in baskets. When the Spanish came, they brought over almonds. And as many of you probably know, almonds use a lot of water. And since California's water largely comes from the Colorado River, they had to change and divert how much water was coming to California to accommodate these types of nuts that required more water. Similarly, coast live oak is the native tree here in Northern California. And when Australians and other Europeans were coming over for the gold rush, they needed a lot of lumber to build houses, to build settlements. And so they needed trees that grew fast, that they could cut down fast. And so they imported eucalyptus trees from Australia because those populate, they overtake the space, and they grow really fast. And so some of you may know that eucalyptus trees are a little bit of an issue here in Northern California. And although I love eucalyptus, I recognize that this species was brought in for a purpose that was not about nature, but instead was about profit and finding gold. And so knowing these histories helps us think more critically about whose land we're on and what conservation means once we understand the myriad impact colonialism has had on the natural landscape. So when we think of conservation and native species, what actually are those and how have they been changed over the last millennia in this landscape? And what has colonialism done to change the landscape? And so it's also about thinking how we define native and what native plant species are and who was conserving the land and these species before the 17th century. And so that brings us again back to indigeneity. So a resource I like to always share is nativeland.ca. And when you go to nativeland.ca, you'll see a map of North America primarily, but other parts of the world. And what this map shows is where the indigenous populations and nations are based on where you are in the United States. And so if you put in your zip code or a city, it'll zoom in and show you the native populations that have historically been there. It will also show you the languages and treaties that were involved with these groups if they are available. Another resource I participate in is called the Shumi Land Tax, and it's a land tax that I pay to Ohlone people who are native to this region so that eventually they can buy back their land and make it a land trust for native people and all people who are currently on Ohlone land here in Northern California. So maybe there's something like this where you are, but these are some resources that sort of acknowledge this history of taking land away from natives and also changing the landscape that they stewarded for so long. So I can't talk about the changing of landscapes without talking about the impacts of slavery on the landscape and on Black people's relationships to land and our ability to access land. Cotton was one of the first luxury commodities in the US and really undergirded the wealth and economic foundation of the United States. And so cotton picked by enslaved Blacks who were brought over from Africa not only was a luxury commodity, but it allowed the UK to dominate in the global textile industry, which previously had been dominated by India, which is one of the originators of cotton seeds. By 1860, about 70% of Southern enslaved Black people worked on cotton plantations. So throughout the South, cotton was the primary crop being produced and cultivated across much of the South. And many of the enslaved Black people who were working on plantations were picking cotton, although they picked other things as well. This large-scale cultivation, production, trade, and export was fueled by global demand, and it created the foundational wealth of the US. So it's really important to think about not only the physical landscape of the US, but the economic landscape, which was produced on stealing land from indigenous people and then importing slaves, importing Africans to be slaves, to pick cotton and other crops that were then sold in a global market and made profit. So I want to just talk a little bit specifically about how cotton cultivation impacted the environment and the landscape since it was so widely produced throughout the United States, particularly in the South. There was a lot of land that had to be cleared because of all of the forests. The Southern United States had these beautiful forests, and so land had to be cleared to make way for plantations. And so this was a sort of systematic deforestation. And because European settlers needed tree wood to build plantation houses and fences, they had to cut down more and more trees. Deforestation meant that there was less natural cover to protect against natural disasters and to create climate stabilization. So the climate is stabilized by plants that sequester carbon and especially forests. So forests are really crucial to keeping the climate steady. Monoculture, meaning only harvesting one crop in mass, meant that you have to eliminate insects and animals that want your crop because of habitat displacement, which is due to the deforestation. So when there's less biodiversity, insects are going to go for what is there. And so European settlers had to get rid of biodiversity, which includes plants that sequester carbon, in order to keep up with this monocultural production of cotton. Another issue was excessive tillage and soil turnover that resulted in widespread soil erosion. So because they were harvesting so quickly, there was not enough time between harvests for soil aggregates to regenerate. And so there's a lot of soil erosion issues, excuse me, particularly in the southern eastern United States as a result of this history of cotton cultivation in mass. The other thing that was happening was that enslaved Black people's relationship to the land became very much associated with violence and exploitation. So, although in pre colonial tropical West Africa, where Black enslaved people came from, there was not a violent relationship to the land. When they were taken over to the Americas because they were enslaved, a lot of their relationships to the land was about violence and exploitation. And what also happened is that European settlers' relationship to the land became about driving value and profit and mass extraction. And so all of our relationships to the land are getting distorted by slavery, but also natural spaces in the woods were places where Black people went to escape slavery and they used plants for medicine. And also European settlers were enjoying the nature and the beauty and painting it and drawing it. So although there's these negative distortions to the land, there's also other relationships to the land coming out of this. So one of the ways I think it's important for us to think about these legacies and to pay homage to them is by supporting people who are currently trying to reclaim their histories and their place in the American national narrative. So I like to use the example of High Hog Farm in Grayson, Georgia. They're a family-owned farm that produces sustainable fiber, cotton, and or other things using climate beneficial practices. And so they think about themselves as reclaiming this narrative of exploitation and fiber cultivation and making it about empowerment, making it about heritage. And so when we think about these sort of legacies of slavery and of natural resource extraction, we could zoom back into modern day to see all the ways that people are disrupting these narratives, showing their perspectives, and also having more healthy and positive relationships to cultivating fiber, which we all need for our clothing and all of the other things that use fiber in our world. So I want to just go through some moments in history that continue to define land access and our relationships to land, especially for Black people between 1860s and the 1950s. So the first thing I want to mention is the Homestead Act of 1862, which gave people up to 160 acres of public land, provided they live on it and claim it. So I'm sure we've seen the Grapes of Wrath and heard the stories about going to claim land, mostly in frontier places in the Midwest and in the west of the country, land that had been stolen from indigenous people. And at this time, that law only applied to European settlers. So indigenous people were not allowed to take advantage of the Homestead Act, and neither were Black people. And also at that time, Black people were still legally enslaved. All of this land was indigenous land that had been taken through years of wars, genocides, and broken treaties. So this was not necessarily land that belonged to the US government in a way that was legal or positive or paid any homage to the indigenous people that had been there. And again, indigenous people and Black people and Chinese people who built railroads going to the West were not allowed to participate in the Homestead Act. During the Reconstruction era, which was 1865 to 1877, free Black men who owned land were given the right to vote. However, at this time, most Black people did not own land at all, and some people were still working on plantations as sharecroppers. And a small group of newly freed Black people were given 40 acres and a mule as an experimental political project. And then the government took that away from them because they thought that if Black people were able to get land, then they would be able to also vote, which would give them political power. And there were the hierarchies of racism that existed would no longer exist. And finally, during this time, the KKK formed to terrorize Black people so that we wouldn't try to own land and we wouldn't try to vote specifically. So from the beginning, it has been about making sure that Black people can't own land and have negative, violent relationships to the land. And we know that currently owning land or owning property gives you more access to political participation and political engagement. So this legacy sort of ripples throughout. The other moments in history I want to mention are in 1872, which was the birth of the first national park. Yellowstone, Ulysses S. Grant, the president, decreed that Yellowstone, I believe 200 acres at the time, was going to be the first national park. What also was happening as early as 1864 was that Yosemite and other national parks were being protected by the Buffalo Soldiers. The Buffalo Soldiers were two cavalries, the 9th and 8th Cavalry of Black soldiers who were sent to protect the parks, mostly from indigenous people, as well as some settlers who had started subsisting off of the land. So they were the first park protectors, even though they were not allowed in national parks and weren't able to access the land for leisure. So at this time, not only were Black people not allowed in national parks, it wasn't safe for them to visit national parks, with the exception of the army men who were there on duty, protecting the plants and protecting the parks and guarding it from indigenous people. So at the time, the nation did not include Black people. Black people didn't own land, they couldn't really vote. So we weren't a part of the nation. So what this meant is in the development of national parks, it wasn't really developed for us. And then we also have to think about these public lands, whose were they really? And who was on these lands before the US and before colonial settlers? And so the whole project of creating national parks was created to exclude people who are crucial to the landscape of the United States, which is indigenous people and Black people. At this time, Black farmers are being killed and their crops are being poisoned. Um, Black communities are not giving infrastructure or loans to rebuild their farms after natural disasters, which have been increasing again because of deforestation caused by plantation slavery. Black agricultural communities are forced to produce for white communities. So some Black communities were asked to create and cultivate and produce food for white communities if they didn't want to be terrorized or if they wanted any funding from government. So again, it puts them in this uneven relationship. And Jim Crow laws are beginning to form in the early 20th century. The world wars are happening, and that's creating mass migrations for Black people out of the South, leaving their land to go north, to go west, to go northeast. And so between 1916 and 1970, 6 million Black people migrated from the South to places in California, in the Midwest, to work mostly on factories and get jobs because of the war. And so what started to happen in the 20th century is that the US cities demographics were changing because more Black people were going there. And so this is the start of racist urban planning laws and design practices, which fueled the environmental justice movement because most of the pollution and freeways were going through the parts of the cities that Black people were living in. So, what are the ripples of this legacy? In an article written by Ashley Gripper, she said, despite these many concerted efforts to thwart Black farmers, they still acquired more than 16 million acres of land at the height of Black farming in the US in 1920. There were more than 5.1 million Black farmers who made up 14% of the overall farming population. But what happened was Black migration also contributed to the decline of Black farmers. And so between 1920 to 1997, Black farmers decreased by about 95% nationwide. And now, of America's 3.4 farmers, 95% are white, and Black owned farms only account for 0.05% of farmland in this country. So the implications of this are that Black people were not able to build wealth through land or pass property down through generations because of the ways we've been dispossessed of land. And so Robert G. Stanton, who was recruited in 1962, became one of the first Black seasonal rangers at Wyoming's Grand Teton National Park. Prior to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, many people of color were legally barred from or segregated at public recreational sites, including national and state parks. And so in the 60s, with Robert G. Stanton and the Civil Rights Act, this is when we first start to see national and state parks opening up and trying to be more welcoming for Black people because it was the law. In 1970, Stanton became the first Black superintendent of a national park unit since Colonel Charles Young was stationed at Sequoia National Park in 1903. And again, Charles Young was part of the Ninth Infantry of the Army who was sent to Sequoia to protect the park, but not to enjoy it. And so one 2018 report indicated that currently Black Americans make up less than 2% of national park visitors. And also studies show that Black people are 75% more likely to live near oil and gas refineries. So throughout these histories and moments that I've been sharing, it's clear that there have been all these ways that we have been dispossessed from the land, excluded from enjoying nature. And this has had ripple effects in the way that we're able to participate and have relationships to the environment. So one of the ways that we can sort of mitigate some of the effects of this legacies is to support Black farmers and Black farms. National Black Farmers Association, started by John Boyd, is an association that advocates for subsidies and loans to go to Black farmers. Keep Growing Detroit is an urban garden that provides fruits and vegetables for people in Detroit because there are no grocery stores there. And so there are tons of Black farms sprouting up around the country and organizations about connecting Black people to land. There's Percussion Farms in Seattle, Washington, which has started to reconnect people of color to the land and our right to healthy lives. Soulfire Farm in New York, which is a BIPOC-centered community farm committed to ending racism and injustice in the food system. I encourage you to look for organizations in your region, in your area, all across California that are doing this type of work to heal our relationships to the land. Additionally, lifting up alternative perspectives and histories about our national parks and our natural places. Yosemite Park Ranger Shelton Johnson does this by talking about the history of buffalo rangers. He also wrote a historical fiction novel about one such gentleman who becomes a buffalo soldier and goes to Yosemite Park where he falls in love with the beauty. So all of these nuanced perspectives about our national parks, about these areas and whose indigenous land that we're on, can be lifted up as a way to think about these histories and also change the future for how we all relate to nature, which we're going to need to do if we're going to survive through climate change. So expanding access is really about supporting access to land and a sense of belonging for everyone in nature. We need to understand and break down these historical generational land legacies. We need to reconnect excluded populations to the land in an equitable, healing, and non-extractive way. This includes opportunities for ownership, land transitions, and inclusive programming in our national and state parks, reserves, and conservancies. This is a picture my partner took of me in State Lobos Point Reserve, which is one of my favorite places in California, and I try to go there once or twice a year. And this was just a moment where I was just like meditating on how beautiful it was and how lucky I was able to go to this place and be there. Even though I barely saw any Black people, I hope that my presence in these spaces encourages more Black people to come to these spaces and heal our relationships to nature, and more people to invite us in and include us in their programming, which I think Crystal Cove is doing really well. So with that, I'll turn it over back to Kate so we can have a conversation and answer some questions.
Great. Thank you, Teju. Really, really appreciate it. It's a topic we've been talking about a lot at the Conservancy. As you know, that's sort of how we found you, is that one of our staff members signed up for one of your courses and came back really inspired by what you talked about. And I think part of that reason is because at the Cove, there's a lot of history to this land, as I think there is to most places. And I'm not sure we've done a great, in fact, I'm sure we haven't done a great job of really talking about those histories and being able to tell the stories of the land. Crystal Cove State Park is on unceded land of the Ahashiman and Tongva people. We're working to collaborate with Sacred Places Institute, other organizations that are trying to mitigate some of that. We also have a history here. We have a Japanese language schoolhouse that has been restored, and we had Japanese farmers who worked the land up until World War II. And so we are in the midst of this. We are really right in this, in figuring out how do we tell these stories? How do we do justice to history um, in a way that invites people in to work with us on it? Can you talk to us a little bit about that? I'm sure you've worked with other organizations, other people who are struggling with these types of issues as well.
Yeah, I think the first part is really reckoning with the history. And sometimes when we think about all of these histories, we sort of feel guilty or ashamed. And I think the first step, if it's feeling guilty, is fine. But then how do we move to a place of collective accountability and use these histories as a springboard to be more inclusive and to think about who may be excluded and who are the people we're not thinking of? And how do we bring Indigenous people in to tell their stories and their ancestors' stories about how they conserve the land and what is native and endemic to this land? So I think I really start with a grounding in geographical history and think about how that may affect some of our identities and our relationships to the land, and then move to what does that mean for our programming and our education and our partnerships. Who are people we can partner with to get more Black kids to the park, or who can we partner with to translate all our materials into Spanish and Vietnamese, for example. So once we reckon with the history and think about the current realities that exist, then we could think of strategies that will be most effective to actually be inclusive, because we'll sort of have a landscape of the ways that we may have unintentionally excluded people, ignored people, or erased them because we weren't ready to deal with or confront with the history of the landscape that we're on.
And that reckoning piece is part of what I feel like sometimes we want to skip. And I say that as a white person, that the reckoning piece can be really difficult. And we don't quite know how to enter the conversation. We're a little bit scared sometimes. But I think that, and I'd love to hear what you think about this, I don't think that we're going to be as effective in figuring out those strategies around how do we get more Black kids to the park? How do we, get our programs in more languages than we have them in now without doing that reckoning and really doing it holistically? So can you talk a bit about that and how we might take some of the trepidation out of that piece?
Mhm. Yeah, often when I consult with organizations, they're like, okay, but could you just give us the strategies? Like, could you just tell us what to do? And I'm always like, nothing I tell you to do is gonna work unless you do this historical geographical analysis, because you're not gonna understand why these strategies are so important or what even is the point of having these conversations. Luckily, we live in a day and age where we can get books so quickly, even too quickly if we're using Amazon. And there's so many books, articles, podcasts, YouTube videos that talk about some of these histories, that talk about these intersections that you can read in the privacy of your home, that you can listen to when you're on a walk, that you can share with your family and friends. You could have these um, you can learn about this information and this knowledge privately. And then when you get more comfortable with it, you come to these talks, you ask questions, you join conversations, you make mistakes, you say things that are problematic, and then you learn why they're problematic, and then you don't do it again. So it's a very iterative process, and it cannot happen in a silo. But I think the first place is that when you're feeling fear or hesitation, just do a quick Google search. Maybe you're particularly interested in plant species. Maybe you're particularly interested in endangered species. Just do a quick Google search about the histories of colonialism and endangered species, or ecological devastation and foreign plants being brought in. There's all of these very niche topics
Right.
that you can dive into. So I would say use the internet as a resource, and then when you get more comfortable, join these conversations because they're happening all over the place.
Yeah. And I think what we've seen is that the more we have the conversations and have them, it's one of the reasons that I started by saying we want to do this work both transparently and intentionally. And I hope that I've created an environment for our team where they feel like they can enter the space, make a mistake, and it's going to be okay. And so I think that piece that you mentioned about being willing to make a mistake, being willing to step into it when you don't quite know what the right words are. I mean, do the work ahead of time, but then be brave and enter the space. And I think that I've been really so delighted by the way that our team has taken this up. And we created our own sort of internal committee to think about these issues. And it's really been heartening to see how our team has taken this up and how much it matters to them. Can you talk a little bit about representation? How important do you think it is, and why does it matter for people to see people who look like them live where they live how they live in parks, not only in the parks and in our sort of publications and social media, but represented on our staff and in our volunteers and on our board? Can you talk a little bit about why that matters, what it can do?
Mm-hmm. One of the ways that these myths about Black people's relationship to the land or not liking camping or not liking hiking is perpetuated by not seeing positive representations of Black people in natural spaces. And so the book that I flashed on the screen was called Black Faces, White Spaces by Carolyn Finney. And she does this whole review of several outdoor magazines, National Geographic, advertisements, and what she sees is that the only ways that Black people are represented in the outdoors is either playing sports like basketball or doing work. And she does the study in 2012, I believe. So even though we know that Black people hike and camp, most of the media that we see of people doing outdoors, adventure things are usually white men or white women. And so when you don't see yourself reflected, you think maybe you're not supposed to be doing that, or maybe you don't belong, or that maybe you can't even do it. Like, why would you decide to go backpacking through Yosemite by yourself if you're going to be the only person there? So representation is also an active experience because it allows you to see what you can do and who you can be. And also seeing people who look like you in positions of power show you that you can change the future if you have the right type of influence, and that people who look like you, who undoubtedly hopefully care about you, are part of shaping the future so that you won't feel the way that you feel 10 years down the line, or in the case of my parents, so that I don't feel the fear that they feel. When I first went to stay overnight in State Lobos, my dad was very worried. He's like, you might need to bring a shotgun. I was like, we don't even have a shotgun. I don't even have a shotgun. Like, what? And like that fear, I didn't have that fear. I didn't even think of that. And that's the point. The point is that he had that fear. I no longer have that fear. And if I decide to have kids, they don't even have to have that conversation, right? And so this is a generations long process, and representation allows us to see over time who belongs and who doesn't belong. And so the more Black people we see in outdoor spaces and natural places, the more commonplace it will be to see us in natural places. And when we are seen, it's not like we're an endangered species. It's like, oh, there are other humans here enjoying this beauty also.
Absolutely. I think the last question that I wanted to just pick your brain a little bit about is where we are situated. So Crystal Cove Park is this amazing piece of miles of coastline and 1,500 acres in the backcountry, and we're nestled between Laguna Beach and Newport Beach in Southern California, some of the wealthiest communities in our nation. And we bring kids in by bus. And we are surrounded on three sides by really these huge developments. And people of color, when they come to the park, I think that there's a piece of it that feels like it's this little piece of nature, but it's surrounded by so much that's inaccessible and so much that is not like where they come from. I'm just wondering what you think about that. If there are ways that we could, address that, be transparent about it, and talk about that in a different way.
That's a really great question. And that was sort of the point my parents made when I talked about going to national parks. They were like, these national parks are in places that are surrounded by potentially hostile white people. And so that was a real fear. And, it's hard to change entrenched communities. But
Mhm.
I think just recognizing that although there are these immediately wealthy white communities surrounding the park, that actually, if you go just a bit further out, you can bring people in who are not very wealthy. And you could see those sort of lines, these sort of political lines of division between where wealthy people and white people live and where people of color live. And of course, not too far from Laguna Beach is a mostly Latinx neighborhood that gets all of the pollution from the port that is blown by the wind. And so that is also part of this story. And so I think it's just important, as you're doing, to just articulate that you recognize that there are these sort of unseen markers of exclusion that people like me may feel. And while you can't change the communities, you can continue to have more people of color in the park, to have programming that invites people in, and the surrounding communities will start to see this. And I also think that in general, racism slows down our ability to create a future that is sustainable. And so eventually it's just about whether or not you want to be a part of the future. And so hopefully the more that people are brought in, welcomed in, there will just be eventually a critical mass of a paradigm shift, that there won't be neighborhoods that are only white and wealthy, and then behind them neighborhoods that are Latinx and working class. So I don't really have a specific answer, but I think just continuing to be honest and explicit about noticing these boundaries of exclusion.
Yeah, I think the noticing can help, being, not acting like it's not there. We do have one more question in the chat. To what extent do you think that social media has helped or hindered young people of color to see people who look like them doing some of these outdoor activities?
Mhm. I definitely think it has helped because in the case of social media, we get to represent ourselves. We show pictures of ourselves going hiking, going backpacking. There are people who love bird watching who happen to be Black people who have Instagram accounts. So there's all of these varieties of relationships to the environment and nature on Instagram because it's people posting about their real and lived experiences. And I think that does encourage other people to go out and maybe rethink their fear and grab a group of friends and say, maybe we should just drive over to Yosemite. Maybe we should drive over to Crystal Cove. So I think it helps in that way, but I think in some senses, it hinders a wider conversation because then there are these influencers, there are certain Black people who are chosen as the outdoorsy type Black people who have the hiking boots, who have the backpacks. And so that may sort of create this sort of tokenization. The first time I got hiking boots was last summer for my birthday, even though I'd been hiking my whole life, because it just wasn't my experience. And so now I have those hiking boots and I love them and they're great. I can't believe I did all the hiking I did without them. But by seeing me as someone with hiking boots who has access to these natural spaces, who has overcome some of these traumas, who feels really comfortable going in outdoors, that may make people expect that every Black kid that comes to the park is like me. And we also want people to experience nature like us. We want it to be quiet. We want to interact with the landscape in a certain way. And so by seeing those of us who have the privilege to interact with nature in that way, it can create these ideas that that's how all Black people should be in nature. And that is a hindrance in and of itself. But I think anything that is done intentionally can be positive, and seeing people represent themselves in the outdoors, I think, is positive on social media.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I could go on talking to you endlessly, exploring all of this, and I thank you for creating a space where we can ask questions and make mistakes. Really, thank you for that. Tonight, our time is at an end. Teju, thank you. Thank you for sharing your work with us. You've inspired us today. Your writing inspires me every day to take this work up in a meaningful way. Thank you for being here, and thank you for the good work that you're doing in the world.
Thank you, Kate. Thanks for having me. I hope it was interesting for people, and continue these conversations. I think they're great and really important.
Yeah, absolutely. To all of you who joined us today, sometimes I'm glad I got to talk to Teju because sometimes these feel a little bit like shouting into a void, but I know you're there. I see your names. I'm so glad that you're with us on this journey. You likewise inspire me and you hearten all of us at the Cove to continue to work toward linked environmental and social justice. So I really want to thank you all for being here tonight. The next event in our series is slated for February 25th, and we'll get an insider's look at the really painstaking process of restoring those historic cottages on the North Beach, which we're well on our way to doing. We'll be joined by our very own Dan G of Crystal Cove Management Company and Dick G, no relation, of Spectra Historic Restoration. So I hope that I will see all of you again then. And even better, I will look for you when I'm in my office. I'll watch for you walking by in the park. I know you're all still here with us, and we're so grateful for that. So thanks to all of you for joining us, and we'll see you again soon. And Teju, thanks again. It's been a real joy.
Absolutely. Thank you. Have a good evening, everyone.
Have a great night. Good night, everyone.